They appeared like a sacred light from a fading age, silent, solemn, and never truly gone. The Knights Templar, warriors in white cloaks marked with the red cross, remembered in history as symbols of unwavering loyalty and unshakable faith. But what made them a threat to kings and empires was never their swords, shields, or gold. It was something far more untouchable: blood. A bloodline said to trace back to ancient royal veins, reaching beyond the bounds of religion and time. When the Templars fell, many believed they vanished. But what survived was something no fire could destroy: legacy, memory, and lineage. From strategic marriages to genealogies never made public, from symbols carved deep into cathedral ceilings to names that quietly repeat wherever power gathers, they never truly left. They simply learned to remain silent and to influence from the shadows. In today's special episode with Bedtime History, we'll follow the hidden traces, the forgotten bloodlines, and the questions no one dares to ask. Is there a force that never disappeared, one still pulling the strings of our world from the darkness? Or to put it another way, is this world ever really ours? If there's a true starting point to all the hidden secrets, where every clue seems to converge into a single underground current, it would be 12th century Jerusalem, a holy land soaked not only in the blood of warriors but also in silent agreements that were never written down. Beneath the Temple of Solomon, in the silence of the crypts where the first 9 Templar knights once lived, it's said that the very first oath to a chosen bloodline was made, not in the light, but in sacred and silent darkness. Some ancient manuscripts, rare and fragmented, surviving only through scattered European library quotes, mention a divine blood connection between a few Templar founders and Eastern lineages claiming descent from King David or the Nazarene. No one ever confirmed it, but the question still lingers: why would a group of poor knights with no land or noble titles be granted powers by the Pope that exceeded both church and state law? Was there something in their blood that made kings both fearful and protective? A legend from southern France tells of a secret night ceremony in Jerusalem, where the Templars swore to protect a child, nameless, without title, but carrying a rare and sacred bloodline. The child was later brought westward with a regular pilgrimage, guarded not as a person, but as a living legacy. There's no solid historical proof. Yet centuries later, inside Rosslyn Chapel, symbols from ancient Judea reappeared with such precision that randomness feels impossible. Jerusalem, where 3 great religions clash and intertwine, didn't just teach the Templars how to fight. It taught them how to watch, how to receive, and how to remain silent. They learned that some secrets can't be preached. They can only be passed down through blood. Those who once walked the halls beneath Solomon's temple didn't leave with just doctrine. They carried something deeper in their veins, a memory, a duty, a responsibility that no written text could ever name. And from that moment on, a quiet current began to flow. Not the kind spilled on battlefields, but a bloodline of unspoken knowledge, of nameless power, of memory that exists beyond language. People would give it vague names: the chosen bloodline, the keepers of memory, or simply the guardians of the secret. That bloodline, like seeds scattered along trade routes, pilgrim paths, and marriage alliances, began to spread far beyond Jerusalem, slowly, carefully, but never stopping. It didn't need victory to survive. It only needed not to be forgotten. Not every Knight Templar shared the same purpose. Behind the familiar white cloak embroidered with a red cross, what history often highlights, there was another layer, quieter, more discreet, and completely absent from any official record. It was a circle within a circle, a secret order within the order, made up of those who didn't just swear loyalty to the ideals of the Crusades, but to a deeper secret passed down not in writing, but through whispers and sometimes through blood. Some Templar rites were never written down. They existed only in underground prayer chambers where candlelight flickered across strange carvings, not quite Christian, yet not fully pagan. Those brought into this inner circle weren't ordinary knights. They were often descendants of families who had given the order land, treasure, or even flesh and blood. In those chambers they made vows that could never be undone, vows to protect a sacred origin that surpassed the boundaries of both religion and dynasty. Scattered notes in Cistercian chronicles, closely tied to the Templars, mention something called familiae reservatae, or reserved families. These weren't just loyal supporters, they became the guardians of the order's most silent legacy, bloodlines. Names like Montbard, Saint Clair, and d'Albon would later appear in key moments of European political history, though rarely as centerpieces. They were the links in the chain, not the flags on the battlefield. Within these families, the forbidden bloodline found a safe haven. Through quiet marriages, their children didn't grow up to take arms like their fathers, but instead became royal advisors, bishops, treasurers. They wore no crown, yet they held what every kingdom coveted, legitimacy, veiled behind relics and ancestry. They didn't need visible power because true power is the kind that stays hidden. In remote monasteries across Languedoc or the Pyrenees, it's said that certain communities existed, ones that only admitted descendants from insider bloodlines. These names never made it into history books, but they're carved in miniature scripts inside ancient manuscripts, next to symbols only the initiated could understand. They lived like monks, but were trained to guard what history was never allowed to know. When the persecution of the Templars spread in the 14th century, not all were burned. Some simply vanished from the records, not killed, but erased from legal memory. They changed names, relocated, but didn't disappear. On paper, they were no longer knights, but in truth they were the ones keeping the flame alive. They built no castles, but they built networks. They needed no title, because they inherited memory. The real secret society never needed a holy land. All it ever needed was a network refined enough to let history pass by without noticing. And from those hidden channels the bloodline crystallized, not through books, but through the veins of the chosen. No one knew exactly who was who, but in a glance, in a symbol, they recognized one another. And that's how memory outlived every kingdom. And it was they, the ones never named, never written into history, who were the true keepers of the secret. Not with swords, but through quiet existence, carried in the heartbeat of a chosen bloodline. Because every great secret needs a place to hide, and every lasting power needs something worth protecting. In the case of the Templars, what they protected wasn't just a person, but a treasure that history was never allowed to name. When King Philip IV of France launched his crackdown on the Templars in 1307, he wasn't just trying to dismantle a powerful military force. He was hunting something he believed could determine the fate of every royal house, a treasure of knowledge and legitimate legacy. But that treasure was never found, not in Paris, not beneath the fortresses, not in the hands of the Vatican, because if it did exist, its essence was no longer in any one place. It had been scattered in a way no one could ever trace, into bloodlines, into marriages, into family branches that lived quietly, yet grew mysteriously wealthy. The Templar treasure wasn't just gold and silver. It was the accumulation of centuries of knowledge, maps, financial networks, and lists of selected families. These families weren't nobility in the traditional sense. They were recipients of special Templar patronage, and because of that, They became the nexus of what would later be known by other names: banks, trade guilds, political dynasties. Starting in the 13th century, many European noble houses began marrying into Templar-descended bloodlines. These unions were never publicly declared, but were carefully recorded in genealogies locked away in iron chests. The purpose wasn't prestige, it was preservation, preserving the bloodline and with it, access to an invisible legacy, symbols, knowledge, and intangible assets. From these links, a new network was born, one with no clear center, yet functioning as a discrete circulatory system of power. The truth is, if you control gold, you can buy time, but if you control blood, you can buy history. The Templars understood that early on. Instead of leaving behind a hoard of treasure, they left behind descendants, people with different names, different passports, but who still held keys to doors most of the world would never even see. Names known only in boardrooms, in back-channel negotiations, or in global charities where world-shaping decisions are made under the mask of humanitarian concern. The true power of the Templar treasure is that it never needed to be hidden. It only needed to be inherited. Blood cannot be stolen. It can be passed down quietly, generation after generation, without ever leaving a trace. And for that reason, in every major event of the modern world, there may still echo an ancient pulse, not from the treasury, but from those who've never been named, yet have never stopped keeping watch. Of all the theories surrounding the bloodline the Templars may have protected, none has stirred more fascination and caution among researchers than the Merovingians, the ancient dynasty that once ruled the lands now known as France. They're remembered not just for their military power, but for a strange legacy, the blending of royal authority and the divine. Some legends claim they carried the blood of Christ and Mary Magdalene. Others say they were descended from the dragon bloodline, an ancient symbol of a mystical connection between humans and supernatural forces. Mainstream historians have long rejected these claims, and yet somehow the myth of the Merovingian bloodline has endured, quietly, persistently, throughout the Middle Ages. And what's suspicious is this. The Knights Templar seem to show up again and again at the crossroads between the Merovingians and the post-Roman world. Some researchers believe the Templars weren't created simply to protect pilgrims or holy sites, but as part of a strategic effort to restore a royal bloodline that had been erased from official history after the 8th century. The Merovingians didn't vanish, they were hidden. Their branches changed names, adopted new identities, but remained present. In genealogies from regions like Languedoc and Provence, names like de Bouillon, de Saint-Clair, and de Gisors appear with unusual frequency, and curiously all have blood or marriage ties to families that once supported the Templars. It doesn't stop there. Merovingian symbols, especially the golden bee, a mark of sacred kingship, have appeared in bas-reliefs, doorframes, even on the crosses of certain Templar buildings. No one can fully explain why. After all, the Templars were an official monastic order of the Church, while the Merovingians were later condemned as heretical. And yet those symbols remain carved in stone, like an unspoken message that something was never fully told. A more daring theory suggests the Templars weren't just preserving the Merovingian bloodline, but quietly preparing for its return, for a Rex Deus, a king of God, to rise when the world falls into utter chaos. Not a king in the feudal sense, but a bearer of ancient legitimacy, a kind of authority that can't be granted by any constitution, only inherited through blood. Of course, the evidence is all circumstantial, but the overlap between families, symbols, and patterns of wealth distribution from the Merovingian era to later centuries is hard to dismiss as coincidence, especially when the descendants of Merovingian side branches are still present today, not on thrones but in banking boards, diplomatic circles, academia, and the arts. If the Templars truly were guardians of the Merovingian line, then modern European history wasn't just written in the blood of conquest, but also carried by a persistent undercurrent, a bloodline too dangerous to name, but too resilient to erase. It didn't need to appear in royal decrees. It only had to survive, beating silently in the hearts of those who still carried memories once burned at the stake. Some days seem like mere dates on a calendar, but in truth they cut so deep that centuries later the wound still bleeds. October 13th, 1307, a Friday, became a stain on history that can never be washed away. Across France, before the sun even rose, doors were smashed open. Monks were dragged from their beds in the dead of night. Men once seen as symbols of loyalty and faith were branded as heretics and traitors. Under a secret royal decree from King Philip IV, the Knights Templar were arrested en masse. And in a single night, an underground empire rooted in politics, finance, and the church seemed to collapse. But that was only the surface. What terrified popes and monarchs wasn't the number of knights or the vaults of treasure. What made them tremble was something even the church didn't dare name, a lineage and a body of knowledge that couldn't be controlled. And just before the purge swept across France, there were signs the Templars knew it was coming. Wealth had already been moved out of Paris. Manuscripts and sacred symbols vanished from monasteries. And most critically, those carrying what was called the memory-keeping bloodline quietly disappeared from every official record. Not everyone born of Templar blood wore the white cloak. Many were illegitimate children, born of quiet liaisons between knights and noblewomen. Others were legitimate sons sent away at a young age to different religious orders, raised with new identities, new nations, and new names. When the Templar order was erased from official maps, these people didn't die with it. They withdrew but carried their vow with them. Quietly, but never in denial, their traces remain. In isolated fortresses in Scotland, in the quiet villages of Portugal, in manuscripts locked inside iron chests at Aragonese monasteries, names like Sinclair, de la Roche, Moray didn't disappear. They simply stepped out of the light. They married, changed surnames, became landowners, teachers, bankers, but under every new title they kept a fragment of the old self, not written on paper but pulsing in their veins. If death ends a dynasty, then exile begins a new system. The sword was gone, replaced by the pen. The fortresses fell, but they built banks. The relics were hidden, replaced by wealth safeguarded in networks of credit and kinship. The power of the Templars wasn't extinguished that day. It was driven deeper, blended into the bloodstream of families history never thought to question. And from that moment on, Friday the 13th wasn't just a folk omen. It became a symbol, a scratch in time reminding us that something once hunted was never truly destroyed. A current still flows beneath the surface, within names, within symbols, and within decisions felt around the world, though no one can trace where the signal first began. History often paints the defeated as ghosts, vanishing, retreating, dissolving into nothing. But if you trace the steps of those who carried Templar blood after that fateful Friday in 1307, something becomes clear. They didn't flee like men who had lost. They withdrew like a strategy already written, and they didn't disappear to escape, but to be reborn. One of the first places to welcome them was Scotland. There, King Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated by the Pope, making him an outsider to the official Christian world. That clash with the Vatican made the northern lands a perfect refuge for the Templars. Disguised as stonemasons, merchants, or monks, they didn't just survive, they began to rebuild. The Sinclair family, guardians of Rosslyn Chapel, didn't just accept the Templar legacy, they protected it as part of their own bloodline. Rosslyn was no ordinary chapel. With encrypted carvings on its pillars, mysterious geometry in its ceilings, and symbols far beyond Christianity, it's said to be a stone gospel for those who knew how to read it. Many believe it was a center of Templar knowledge transmission, its secrets hidden behind layers of symbolism even the Church couldn't decipher. Meanwhile, in Portugal, the Templars didn't just survive, they were reborn in plain sight. With the silent approval of the monarchy, they were rebranded under a new name, Ordem de Cristo, the Order of Christ. The organization carried all the hallmarks of the Templars: structure, symbols, and networks. This wasn't a revival, it was a transformation. Through it, the Templar bloodlines seeped into the royal marriages of Portugal and Spain, then sailed across the seas, further than any pope had ever dreamed. In southern France, Languedoc, the Pyrenees, once a spiritual fortress of the Templars, castles stood abandoned. Small monastic orders suddenly closed themselves off from the world. But in that quiet, manuscripts, codes, and genealogies were preserved, passed down from generation to generation. Titles weren't necessary. Their descendants still knew exactly who they were. They lived as provincial nobles, but a single handwritten letter or a discreet symbol was enough to reawaken a network the fires could never fully destroy. From there, a slow, steady migration began. They moved into Flanders, the Rhineland, Lombardy, eventually embedding themselves into the fabric of the Holy Roman Empire. No longer knights, they became financial advisors, bishops, bankers. Names like Fugger, Welser, even Medici would later show traces of connection to families who once sheltered or married into the Templar bloodline. They didn't need to keep their old form. Power had moved on from the sword. It now lived in the control of information, credit, and relationships. The Templars weren't trying to reclaim any throne. They blended into the mainstream of history, but never dissolved into it. While the Church believed it had uprooted a heretical force, the roots had already taken hold deeper. Roots of marriage, roots of finance, roots of memory, encoded in genealogies that would never be published. What remained wasn't a secret order, but a kind of bloodline network, unnamed, untraceable, but always there, like a quiet heartbeat beneath the empires that followed. In the quiet undercurrents of European history, there are families that never needed crowns or conquests to carve their names into power. The Sinclair family of Caithness and Rosslyn is one of them, a lineage that rarely appears in official chronicles, yet consistently shows up in the margins where history forgets to look. And it was in the hills of Scotland near Edinburgh that they left behind something generations still haven't fully unravelled: Rosslyn Chapel. From the outside, Rosslyn looks like a small Gothic chapel, but the moment you cross its threshold, you're no longer inside a religious building, you're inside a memory machine carved from stone. Every column, every carved detail, every sliver of light seems to echo something far beyond theology. This place isn't for prayer, it's for remembrance. On Rosslyn's walls you'll find ancient geometry, symbols from Judaism, Christianity, even Eastern mysticism, all arranged with an intentionality that's impossible to ignore. It's a coded structure. Maize, American corn, aloe flowers and other plants unknown in Europe before the 15th century appear with strange precision. And yet this chapel was built in 1446, nearly 50 years before Columbus ever set foot in the New World. So who brought those images here, and why? No one in the Sinclair family ever denied their connection to the Knights Templar. In some of their private genealogies, certain members are marked with circles, slashes, or symmetric crosses, codes for those deemed bloodline keepers. Quiet marriages between families with Templar ties, survivors of 1307, were carefully recorded, not publicized, but just enough to preserve the union of blood. Rosslyn, then, isn't just a chapel, it's a stone map, a symbolic archive. Some believe it was from here that greater plans were conceived, even the first transatlantic voyages to America. The legend of Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, sailing to Nova Scotia in 1398 still lives on in the oral traditions of Canada's indigenous Mi'kmaq people. They speak of men in white robes bearing symbols of light. There's no official record to confirm it, but no historian has dared fully dismiss the strange connection between Rosslyn and Templar traces in North America. Rosslyn has survived war, religious reform, fire, and forgetfulness. It was never desecrated, never destroyed, as if some invisible hand has always guarded it, a place that must never fall, because if the memory held in its stones is ever lost, then a chapter of history that was never allowed to be written will vanish forever. In a world where every symbol is eventually commercialized, Rosslyn has kept one thing: silence. It doesn't explain, it doesn't prove, it simply exists like a sacred hymn carved in stone, meant only for those whose memory is waiting to be awakened. And if there's any place on earth where the Templar bloodline needs no seal to remain untouchable, it is Rosslyn Chapel, where daylight passes through stained glass windows only to remind us that darkness has always known how to hide in plain sight. If Rosslyn is the stone gospel of silent memory, then the Habsburg Empire is where that bloodline began to wear the face of open power. No dynasty in modern Europe left a broader or deeper mark than the House of Habsburg. They ruled not only Austria, Spain, and the Netherlands, but extended their reach across nearly every center of power in Europe for centuries. But one question still lingers. How did a family that started with a few castles in Switzerland rise to become a transcontinental force that lasted generations? There's an explanation outside of official history, one found in hidden genealogies. The Habsburgs didn't rise alone. They were connected through marriage, secret alliances, and financial backing from bloodlines that once formed the lifeblood of the Templar network. In 14th and 15th century marriage records, one finds brides and lords from Languedoc, Provence, and Aragon, regions that served as post-Templar strongholds, wedding into various Habsburg branches. Some records are incomplete, others mysteriously redacted, but the names of the regions remain. The Habsburgs' infamous policy of extreme intermarriage has often been viewed as a symptom of power obsession. But from a bloodline perspective, it looks more like a strategy of genetic control to keep their bloodline from being diluted, especially if they believed they were safeguarding something sacred. In their heraldry, the double-headed eagle, the sacred crown, the twin cross, there are strange echoes of Templar symbols. Some 15th century seals even resemble the Templar sigil, like royal copies, cloaked in legitimacy. In the Royal Library of Vienna, certain sealed documents are filed under the name Ordo Interior, an inner brotherhood connected to banking circles and royal advisors. The names of its members have never been revealed. But financial records show money flowing between anonymous trusts in Portugal and Spain, the very places where the Templars had once found refuge and were reborn. This isn't coincidence, it's inheritance of assets, of knowledge, and of memory. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who ruled both Spain and Austria, once declared that his authority was a gift from God, protected by loyal angels. It sounds like theology, but it could just as easily be a coded reference to a nameless, creedless protection network, people outside of recorded history, yet always close to the hand that writes it. Dynasties may fall, but bloodlines don't need names to survive. When the Habsburgs splintered, their blood spread quietly, through marriages unmentioned in the press, through illegitimate children, through those born into silence and raised among scholars, bankers, and clergy. That bloodline didn't ask for a throne, it chose influence. If the Templars truly embedded themselves into the structure of the Habsburgs, then post-medieval Europe wasn't ruled solely by swords and laws. It was also shaped by a bloodline memory, resilient, unnamed, and strong enough that even the Vatican never dared to call it by its true name. And in that sense, power no longer needed symbols. It only needed to be inherited. When history is written by those who hold the pen, the shadowy connections are often pushed into the margins, but between incomplete genealogies, vague titles, and portraits with missing surnames, there's always a thread no one dares name, a bloodline that never sat on the throne but always stood beside it. After the Templar Order was officially dissolved, its survivors didn't vanish. They entered a new phase, no longer as knights but as husbands, fathers, and advisors. They married into royal families not to seize power but to exchange something deeper, legitimacy. When a persecuted bloodline fuses with a ruling one, the result is not a rebellion, but an unbreakable alliance. In England, starting from the 14th century, there are clear signs of Norman noble families, many of whom had once supported or sheltered the Templars, intermarrying with side branches of the Plantagenets, then the Tudors, and eventually the Stuarts. Names like Percy, Neville, and Howard didn't just appear on battlefields, they also appeared in royal libraries, treasury offices, and as tutors to future kings. In genealogical records preserved in monasteries across northern England, many lines appear scratched out or renamed, but the side symbols remain: a slanted cross, a circle within a triangle, or an eye beneath a crown. In France, the former power centre of the Templars and the birthplace of their persecution, the remnants of that bloodline didn't disappear. They blended into the Bourbon and Orleans houses, often through marriages where dowries were paid with property once belonging to the Templars. Archives at the French National Library note land transfers of unclear origin, estates once held by Templar commanderies that ended up in the hands of families with no documented lineage, yet somehow received noble titles from the crown without explanation. One especially revealing case is the Kingdom of Aragon, where Templars were protected as the Northern Papal Crusade hunted them. By the 15th century, marriages between Catalonian nobles and branches of the Castilian line produced a generation of descendants with dual inheritance, one side royal, the other born of suppressed memory. When examining key figures in the Spanish court of the 16th and 17th centuries, many turn out to be descended from families that once aided the Templars, yet went on to play leading roles in institutions like the Inquisition or in newly formed secret societies. There's no official document stating that these royal houses knew they were merging with a bloodline once hunted by the Church, but looking back at the kings, queens, advisors, and powerful clerics from the 15th century to the French Revolution, one pattern repeats. Beside every throne stood someone with no grand title, but an uncanny influence over strategy, treasury, and especially the education of the next generation. These figures on the edge often vanish when traced back more than 3 generations, like they emerged from thin air. But it's in those gaps that the Templar bloodline spread. No name needed, no coat of arms, just a memory and symbols understood only by those within the circle. And perhaps behind every throne ever built, there's always been a foundation made not of stone, but of memories never spoken aloud. A memory from a bloodline once burned, but never broken. Some eras carry the name of light, but in truth, they are the shadows where ancient memory returns under a new disguise. The Renaissance wasn't just a revival of Greek and Roman art. It was the moment when bloodlines once hunted found a new way to exist, not through the sword, but through image, sound, proportion, and geometry. They didn't need to rebuild an empire, they rebuilt the mind. Beneath the domes of Brunelleschi, within the paintings of Leonardo, and across the strange maps of Italian explorers, a different language begins to appear, one never meant for the crowd. It was the language of symbols, codes, sacred proportions, the very same elements the Templars once carved into chapel ceilings and the undersides of their shields. These weren't revived for beauty. They were resurrected for memory. Leonardo da Vinci belonged to no known secret order, yet in his paintings there's something unmistakably close to the architecture of Rosslyn Chapel. The Last Supper, the Vitruvian Man, Mona Lisa, these works weren't just art. They felt like encrypted messages from a forgotten time. The proportions, the lighting, the placement of hands, the direction of the gaze, everything arranged as if to carry forward something buried. His geometric principles align almost perfectly with secret Templar diagrams once held by Cistercian monks in the monasteries of Languedoc. In Florence, the Medici family, patrons of nearly the entire Renaissance movement, had undocumented financial links to noble houses in Spain and Portugal. Coincidentally, these were the very regions where the Templars had re-emerged as the Order of Christ. These monetary flows, never fully explained in ledgers, align with periods of explosive growth in cathedrals, printing presses, and scientific academies. Art wasn't just inspiration, it became the perfect shell for memory. Even Raphael and Botticelli, names we now associate purely with beauty, left behind odd details in their works. A subtle curve, a tilted finger, a swirl in the fabric of a robe, when decoded using Pythagorean cipher or Kabbalistic systems, they form what appear to be hidden bloodline maps. These men weren't inventors of the secret, they were chosen to carry a piece of it, either because they, or those who funded them, were tied to a bloodline that had once been burned but never destroyed. So if in the Middle Ages the Templars guarded the bloodline with sacred oaths and strongholds, then in the Renaissance they protected it through symbol, proportion and light. No proclamations, no weapons, just a mark etched into a dome, a shaft of light cast through stained glass at a precise time of year. That was enough to tell the initiated that memory had not died. As reason began to replace faith and art became the new religion, the Templars were no longer hunted. They began to reshape the world through culture, through science, and through their ability to breathe ancient truth back to life in forms no one dared question, not with words, but with structure. And while Europe believed it was entering an age of reason, that very reason may have been shaped by those who were once burned alive for holding a truth that was never meant to fit the age they lived in. They say military power builds empires, but it's finance that keeps them alive. While kings battled over borders, loyalty, and honor, the Templars, very early on, learned to control a different kind of power, the flow of wealth. And that was the one thing no fire could destroy. As early as the 12th century, the Templars became the invisible architects of a financial system far ahead of its time: promissory notes, asset custody, and cross-border money transfers. A pilgrim could deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem, using a system that even kings and popes relied on. Trust in the Templars was greater than trust in law. They became Europe's first true bank, and that, perhaps more than anything, was why they were eliminated. But when the Templar order collapsed, their system didn't vanish. It simply changed form. Just a few decades after the purge of 1307, family banks began appearing all over Europe, mysterious in origin, yet operating with remarkable sophistication. In Flanders, northern Italy, and Basel, once obscure financial houses suddenly rose to prominence: the Fuggers, the Medicis, the Welses, and later, the Rothschilds. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Many independent scholars believe that some branches of the Templar legacy didn't flee. They transformed. They let go of the title of knight, but preserved the network, maritime charts, archive systems, trusted clientele, and encrypted asset codes. They didn't need crowns because they held what even kings had to borrow: credit. In Florence and Venice, epicenters of banking's rise, Templar descendants quietly settled after their escape. They weren't there as guardians of relics, they were there as signers of contracts. They founded merchant guilds, academies, and eventually secret societies. They shifted from the cross to the Fibonacci spiral, from hymnals to ledgers. Their armor became silk robes, but their mission, to safeguard knowledge, remained untouched. Small clues seem to have been left behind on purpose. In 15th century account books, faint Templar symbols appear etched along the paper's edge. In the storage vaults of the Fugger Bank in Augsburg, the architectural design mirrors that of old Templar treasuries in Languedoc. Basel's interbank secrecy pacts used numeric systems strikingly similar to 13th century asset distribution maps. Most revealing of all, these financial families maintained a sacred tradition, controlling who they married. They only wed within certain bloodlines, often among merchant scholars or former nobility, preserving what might be called a map of memory. They didn't name it bloodline, but the way they protected family character makes it clear. This wasn't just a strategy of wealth. It was a strategy of remembrance. And so, while cathedrals fell, armies dissolved, and kings were overthrown, money kept flowing. And where there's credit, there's influence. Once the Templar bloodline merged into the financial system, it no longer needed weapons or territory to survive. It only needed to control the rules of the game, not through declarations, but through interest rates, deadlines, and a network no one could trace back to its origin. If the Templars were burned for guarding a memory too ancient for their time, then the Illuminati rose from those ashes, not bearing cloaks or relics, but carrying ideas. They didn't build fortresses, they designed systems. They didn't challenge the church with swords, but with philosophy. And the deeper one dives into their codes, symbols, and organizational layers, the more distant echoes from the past begin to resurface. The Illuminati was officially founded in 1776 in Ingolstadt, Germany, by Adam Weishaupt. Outwardly, it was a society opposing the power of the church and feudal monarchy, but internally its structure bore an uncanny resemblance to the ancient Templars: hierarchies, initiation rites, inner circles, coded language, and esoteric symbols. The group's first charter, the manuscript of Regensburg, used an encryption system strikingly similar to the Codex Templi, a Templar text once preserved by Carthusian monks. The members of the Illuminati weren't simply progressive thinkers. Many carried surnames linked to side branches of the Medici, Orleans, and Lorraine families, bloodlines that had once sheltered or intermarried with the Templars. Others were scholars funded by old banking dynasties like the Fuggers, houses that had discreetly protected post-Templar descendants across generations. So who were the Illuminati? 3 theories remain in contention. The first, that the Illuminati were a direct rebirth of the Templars, a bloodline carrying old memories and sacred heritage, now reawakening in an age of reason. They didn't need castles or armor. They needed structure, ideology, networks of knowledge, and the means to infiltrate emerging political systems. They were the keepers of the flame, but now fanning it into the light of reform, science, and freedom. The second theory sees the Illuminati as a betrayal of the original ideals, a group of secular intellectuals who hijacked Templar structure and symbolism to create a worldly version of power, using sacred signs once tied to spiritual memory as tools for radical rationalism. They didn't inherit the bloodline, they distorted it. They didn't uphold the ancient oath, they turned it into a mechanism to steer a society adrift. The third, that the Illuminati was a controlled experiment, an intentional creation by Templar descendants themselves, an internal countercurrent designed to test how modern society might react when ancient memory is reawakened. If the world was ready, they would step forward. If not, the attempt would dissolve quietly. And if this theory holds true, then the Illuminati was never the final goal, only a phase. What's most remarkable is this: when the Illuminati was dismantled, its key members didn't disappear. They re-emerged in Freemasonry, in the French intellectual elite, and in the early central banks of Europe. The name may have faded, but the structures and symbols remained, engraved on currency, embedded in architecture, embedded in rituals, and even the language of politics. No one can say with certainty that the Illuminati were the Templars reborn. But if you trace the overlap of symbols, bloodlines, and ideological influence closely enough, something older, far older, still seems to be moving behind the scenes, not under the name of the Knights Templar, but under the shadow of a torch relit, in an age that believed it had left the past behind. Among the strange symbols of Freemasonry, the compass, the square, the all-seeing eye, sacred geometry, there's something that makes anyone familiar with the Templars feel a chill. These images aren't new, they've simply changed form. And if the Illuminati were a continuation of Templar philosophy, then Freemasonry is where the Templar bloodlines architecture was rebuilt, openly, yet never fully graspable. From as early as the 16th and 17th centuries, when Masonic lodges first emerged in Scotland and England, many founders were directly connected to families that had once sheltered or intermarried with Templar survivors. Names like Sinclair, Neville, and noble houses from Languedoc, once closely tied to the Templar order, reappeared as architects, merchants, and scholars. But they carried with them a history that was never written down. Freemasonry's three-tiered structure, apprentice, fellowcraft, master mason, mirrors the ranks of the ancient Templar hierarchy. Its initiation rituals, coded language, seating arrangements, even body signals used in closed-door meetings all point to a deeper origin than official documents admit. Symbols like the blazing star, the clasped hand, or the broken cross, they aren't products of the Renaissance, they're memory recoded for a new age. And more telling still, Freemasonry's religious neutrality, the very thing that led the Church to repeatedly condemn it, echoes one of the same reasons the Templars were burned. Both guarded knowledge that transcended the boundaries of orthodox theology. They didn't depend on dogma. They believed in an inner light, a light only visible to the chosen. In genealogies preserved within the Grand Lodges of England and Scotland, certain family lines appear in both realms, guardians of post-Templar memory and founders of modern Freemasonry. Could this be proof that Freemasonry wasn't an unconscious continuation, but rather a deliberate redesign, crafted by descendants adapting their structure to a world with no place left for swords and cloaks? Some scholars suggest that the first Masonic lodges were safe havens for Templar descendants, a place to pass on maps, secret knowledge, bloodlines, and memory without fear of persecution. As time shifted, the order expanded, welcoming nobility, artists, architects, and scholars, but the bloodline at the core remained concealed, passed through higher degrees, known only to those invited behind the inner door. Officially, Freemasonry denies any formal connection to the Templars. Yet in the York Rite system of American Freemasonry, the highest degree is called Knight Templar, and it includes a ritual reenactment of the oath at Solomon's Temple. That oath closely matches inscriptions found in ancient Templar fortresses. It could be symbolism, or perhaps it's a way for those carrying the old blood to recognize one another, using a language the modern world no longer sees as threatening. No need for secrecy, no need for public declaration. Freemasonry became a new robe for the Templar bloodline, a robe just public enough to survive, just mysterious enough to preserve memory. In dimly lit chambers, surrounded by symbolic tools, with a book open to the right page, they didn't have to say much. Presence was enough. If the Templars were once burned for guarding knowledge too far ahead of its time, then Freemasonry stands as proof that when that knowledge is merged into blood and encoded in symbol, no fire can ever burn it away again. When people speak of the age of exploration, the story always begins in 1492. But there's another layer of memory etched in stone, hidden in symbols, and passed down through severed bloodlines that suggests the Templars may have reached the New World long before Columbus, not under the Spanish flag but beneath white sails with no allegiance, carrying something that could never be declared, a hunted bloodline and a legacy that couldn't fall into the hands of church or crown. Once again, Rosslyn Chapel becomes the starting point of a question no one dares answer directly. Carvings of maize and aloe, plants entirely unknown in Europe before the discovery of America, were already present at Rosslyn in the 15th century. The botanical accuracy of these carvings makes it hard to dismiss as artistic imagination. They seem copied from the first-hand accounts of someone who had truly seen them. According to a widely discussed theory among independent researchers, after the Templar Purge of 1307, a group of survivors escaped through hidden ports in Portugal and Scotland. They carried not just knowledge and treasure, but people, those considered living links to a chosen bloodline. Leading them, it said, was Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, who may have organized a transatlantic voyage in 1398, nearly a full century before Columbus set sail. In Nova Scotia, Canada, the Mi'kmaq people still tell stories of pale-skinned men in glowing robes bearing symbols of light and the cross. These aren't part of official historical records, but their descriptions strangely match the Templars. Informal surveys in the region have uncovered stones etched with geometric symbols resembling Templar codes, Gothic-style engravings, and even hidden stone chambers deep in the forests, built in ways nearly identical to Templar treasuries in Europe. Why did they come? Not to conquer, not to convert. They came to hide what could no longer be kept safe in Europe. Fragments of memory, fragments of blood, and perhaps even a piece of what was once called the treasure. Not gold or silver, but a network of heirs and maps of forgotten knowledge. North America at that time had no pope, no empire, no Western laws, making it the perfect destination for a legacy that needed to reconfigure itself in silence. If the theory is true, then the history of America didn't begin with discovery, it began with a strategic retreat. And if Rosslyn was the chapel of memory, then the New World became the place where that memory was hidden once more, not underground, but between the empty spaces of official history. Maybe they never meant to leave a trace. Maybe being forgotten was part of the plan, because what is unwritten can never be destroyed. And sometimes the places not on the map are where the bloodline is safest. When the United States was founded, the world saw it as a triumphant rebellion against monarchy and religious authority, a new symbol of liberty, democracy, and individual rights. But peel back the layers, look closely at the symbols, the bloodlines, and the architecture of American power, and you'll find that not everything was new. Something very old, very quiet, very deliberate may have been carried over from another world. From Rosslyn, from Jerusalem, from oaths whispered in shadows that were never written down. George Washington, the first U.S. president, was a high-ranking Freemason. He personally presided over the laying of the Capitol building's cornerstone using an old European ritual. The Washington family has Norman roots, and in English genealogical records there are faint links to the Sinclair and Howard families, both deeply tied to Templar descendants after 1307. That may be coincidence. But when viewed alongside a string of other patterns, coincidence starts to lose ground. Some controversial bloodline studies suggest that more than 30 of America's 45 presidents, as of the early 21st century, trace their ancestry to European noble houses from the Middle Ages, where the Templars once held central influence. Adams, Roosevelt, Bush, Kennedy all have branches in their family trees that connect to bloodlines the Church once branded as heretical. Among them, the Bush family stands out, 2 presidents, both distantly connected to the Plantagenets, a royal house believed to have had close financial and political ties to the Templars. George W. Bush was also a member of Yale University's Skull and Bones, a secret society with rituals, structure, and symbolism uncannily similar to the blood oath systems of old Europe. They've never claimed to be a Templar legacy. But the organizational model, layered secrecy, and coded imagery speak in the same frequency. Even in the Great Seal of the United States, the eye above the unfinished pyramid, the number of stars, the ribbon's Latin text, there are symbols there that seem eerily familiar. These aren't born of democracy. They're echoes of encoded memory. The geometry of the seal has been analyzed using Kabbalistic principles once employed by the Templars in map-making and ritual design. America's political system, its division of powers, personal oaths, and internal checks, wasn't just the product of Enlightenment minds. It reflects a kind of moral order once embedded in the Templar rulebook. No allegiance to kings, no obedience to popes, only loyalty to a structure more sacred than law, but hidden beneath it. If this theory holds, then when a US president places their hand on the Bible to take the oath of office, it isn't just a secular ceremony, it's the modern form of a very ancient vow, echoing from the Temple of Solomon, passed through secret societies, recoded into a modern ritual for a position no longer called knight, but carrying the same weight. There is no document that proves this. But history doesn't always need to be written. Sometimes it only needs to be designed. And if the old bloodlines learned long ago that exposure brings destruction, perhaps they chose a different path, silence but presence, right at the center of modern power. No more fortresses. They built a nation. No more swords. They wrote a constitution, but in every carved seal, every solemn oath, every eye atop an unfinished pyramid, there may still echo a memory that never truly went to sleep. Among all the monarchies still standing in today's world, the British royal family is perhaps the most public, polished symbol of traditional power. Every detail of their rituals, from robes and scepters to crowns and the sword of justice, is arranged like a sacred performance, crafted to maintain an unbroken sense of continuity through the centuries. But it's that very perfection that raises the question, what lies hidden beneath all those carefully layered ceremonies? The House of Windsor, formerly Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, is actually a fusion of German, French, Austrian, and Scottish bloodlines. If you trace back from Edward I to Edward III, you'll find side branches that intermarried with nobles from Aquitaine, Languedoc, and Normandy, regions that once served as spiritual strongholds of the Templars. Some marriages left no clear family names, only vague titles like Duchess of the Southern Lands. But their coats of arms feature familiar Templar symbols: the tilted cross, the double-barred cross, the crescent moon, each once used as coded imagery by the order. Edward I once drew on Templar resources and manpower during his campaigns in Scotland. Some of his commanders, though not formally recorded as Templars, wore red crosses and were knighted at monasteries with deep connections to the order. When the persecution of 1307 began in France, many Templars fled to England, where the response was notably more lenient. They vanished from records, but new families soon emerged at court, with sudden wealth and influence no one could explain. In libraries like Hatfield House and Woburn Abbey, sealed genealogies reference extralinear unions with coded marks instead of names. Children from these unions didn't become battlefield lords. They became bishops, treasurers, royal advisors, positions of influence without titles. The crescent symbol in Prince William's personal coat of arms, heir to the throne, was once common in Templar stonework in the Pyrenees. Balmoral Castle, the royal summer residence, lies not far from where Templar outposts once stood after their escape in 1307. These aren't hard proofs, but when these clues repeat across centuries, it becomes harder to dismiss them as mere coincidence. The issue isn't just the symbols, it's how memory is managed. Some royal documents remain sealed under 500-year restrictions. Royal DNA is never tested publicly. Marriages approved within the family sometimes defy both social and traditional norms, but are defended under the banner of privacy and history. Any one of these things could be rationalized, but seen together they suggest a memory being guarded more tightly than any political file. Could it be that the throne wasn't only built to rule, but to shield something, not to conceal wrongdoing, but to protect something too ancient, too foundational, a current running beneath the very idea of modern monarchy itself? Perhaps no one in the royal family even knows it. Perhaps they, too, are links in a chain set long before England had a constitution. But if real power doesn't need a name, then the idea that a bloodline once burned at the stake in France might now be riding in a royal carriage, waving beneath the fireworks over London, is no longer just a myth. In the modern world, few families are as admired and as questioned as the Rothschilds. What began as a modest coin-dealing shop in Frankfurt in the late 18th century evolved, in just a few generations, into a banking network that stretched across Europe: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples. But what places the Rothschilds at the heart of so many conspiracy theories isn't just their wealth, it's the near-total silence surrounding their bloodline origins. As if even they know that something needs to be hidden more carefully than bank accounts. According to official history, Mayer Amschel Rothschild was the founder, dividing financial control among his 5 sons. But there's a large unexplained gap. Where did the initial capital come from to fund an expansion of such scale across Europe? There's no record of inheritance, no early royal patronage, only vast sums mobilized as if they had already been waiting, stored in the shadows of an unnamed network. Some unofficial sources suggest Mayer Amschel had connections to hidden Jewish communities in Spain, groups that once sheltered the Templars after the 1307 purge, and who were later forced to convert to survive the Inquisition. Within these closed circles, ancient financial knowledge, asset encryption systems, and memory of the Templars were preserved, not through books but through ritual and oral transmission. As a collector of rare coins and esoteric symbols, Mayer Amschel may have gained access to manuscripts believed to originate from the Templars. The Rothschild family crest, 5 arrows representing the 5 sons, strangely mirrors the 5 paths of sacred light from Templar cryptography, where 5 directions symbolized the 5 safe havens after the persecution. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the Rothschilds weren't just financiers. They were the guarantors of fallen monarchies, buyers of war debt, and architects of European currency restructuring after Napoleon. No one elected them. No one gave them noble titles, yet no decisions were made without them in the room. If the Templars once guarded a treasure not made of gold but of decentralized structures, credit networks, and encoded memory of a sacred order, then Rothschild may have inherited that infrastructure, not publicly, not by name, but they operated it with greater precision than any church or royal house ever did. The Rothschild family's genealogy has never been fully disclosed. Marriages within the family were tightly controlled, almost absolutely. New members entering the inner circle underwent background screening so extensive it later served as a model for intelligence agencies around the world. The Rothschilds may not carry Templar blood in the literal sense, but if true power is the ability to replicate the architecture without fortresses, without relics, and with veto power over global currents, then they might be the final embodiment of that legacy, not called the Templar Order, but keeping its spirit alive through currency, silence, and the ability to never need to speak. In a world where monarchies have faded but banks endure, the real question may no longer be who rules, but who cannot be removed. And if the Templar power was once burned for being too great, perhaps now it survives by hiding the entire body, leaving only the heartbeat behind, a heartbeat written in balance sheets, in global interest rates, and in a silence that has its reasons. In today's political maps, power is defined by borders, institutions, and markets. But when you look at what truly drives the world, from energy, finance, and media to global health, you'll find it's not nations at the helm, it's family networks. And not just any families, but lineages that existed long before modern states were born, and may well outlive them. Names like Rockefeller, Agnelli, DuPont, Oppenheimer, Morgan, Walton, Koch. They're not just founders of companies. When you trace the ownership structures of the trusts, investment boards, holding companies, and research institutes they established, a strange pattern emerges. The names don't disappear with each generation. They simply change positions, from shareholder to overseer, from advisor to patron, from CEO to anonymous benefactor. And the deeper you go into these genealogies, the more they begin to resemble a neural network. Families that seem unrelated, one from Europe, one from America, one from the Middle East, intersect at blurry points in post-Templar history. The transatlantic marriages of the 18th and 19th centuries weren't just economic alliances, they were bloodline strategies, creating a generation of dual-power heirs, financial and cultural, East and West, ancient and modern. In many cases, these bloodlines changed names, passports, and domiciles, shifting assets to tax havens, but maintained one thing, a closed structure, a family council. They don't meet in parliaments, but in Tuscan villas, Swiss castles, and flagless super yachts. There are no resolutions, only consensus, no debates, just silent shares. And every global reform, whether in health, climate, data, or war, unfolds within that ecosystem. One telling sign is the recurrence of certain surnames across unrelated global boards. Someone who sits on an investment fund in California also advises an NGO in Geneva, while quietly directing an asset trust in Bermuda. These names don't seek the spotlight, but they always appear at the right time, in the right place, and often in positions that simply cannot be replaced. Some families make no secret of their quiet pride in what they call Templar legacy, even if they never formally acknowledge it. Stylized crosses, twin pillars, the double pine tree, the all-seeing eye, these symbols appear in the logos of investment firms, academic institutions, and even the emblems of global ethics councils. These are no longer religious symbols, they're markers of inner identity. Universities like Yale, Harvard, Oxford, Stanford aren't just schools for elites, they're filters, where those of the blood are tested for adaptability, intelligence, and the ability to keep silent. Admission isn't determined by test scores, but by background that never appears on paper. From there, a new generation is brought into the ecosystem of power, not because of inheritance, but because they are trusted to be close enough to the original memory. There is no document proving the existence of a global bloodline council, but financial disclosures, cross-ownership records, and multi-sector investment reports suggest this much. Coincidence has long been surpassed. Power no longer comes from weapons or ballots. It flows from a network no one realizes they live inside. And if you trace back deep enough through the arteries that feed the world systems, you won't find a national flag. You'll find an oath, a memory, a bloodline that no longer needs religion for legitimacy or thrones to rule, because it has become the ecosystem of the modern world itself. And when those bloodlines intersect long enough, quietly enough, and consistently enough within the structure of global power, one thing becomes clear: this is no longer about individual families. It's an ecosystem, but that ecosystem cannot function without a point of convergence, a place where those never elected still shape global policy, a place with no flag, no anthem, yet more hierarchy than any parliament ever assembled. That place is called Bilderberg. Bilderberg is not a myth. It's a real entity with a history, locations, and guest lists. Founded in 1954 at the Hotel de Bilderberg in the Netherlands, it was from the beginning a discreet gathering of Western elites, heads of state, central bankers, multinational CEOs, media moguls, and strategic scholars. Once a year, between 120 and 150 people are invited to a luxury hotel, surrounded by military-grade security. No press, no recordings, no transcripts, and most importantly, no one ever asks why they were invited. On paper, it's described as a forum for free global thought exchange, but to those who track transgenerational power, Bilderberg looks like a 21st century version of a post-Templar secret order. No temple, no crest, just the machinery of silent consensus. It's not about what's said, it's about who is invited and who isn't. The guest lists across the decades show a pattern, the same bloodlines returning generation after generation: Rothschild, Rockefeller, Agnelli, DuPont, Van Zeeland, de Castries. Names that, if traced backward through history, touch regions once held by the Templars, or families that were links in the post-Templar network. They don't call themselves Templars, but their operational structure and influence echo a very familiar order, one built on vows and buried knowledge. Bilderberg has no constitution, no national flag, but everyone inside knows their place. The younger invitees, usually rising politicians, tech founders, or thought leader academics, are assessed not just for their ideas, but for their mental compatibility. And that isn't defined by education, but by a kind of collective memory passed down, never taught. In many closed-door sessions, witnesses have noted strange symbols: twin pillars, the circle within the square, an unfinished pyramid topped by a single eye. All of them once tied to the Templars, later repurposed by Freemasonry and the Illuminati. These images are never publicly explained, yet they appear on seating arrangements, private invitations, and limited edition internal documents. If the Templars once unified the scattered powers of medieval Europe into a sacred financial military network, then Bilderberg is that concept reborn for the age of globalization, linking central banks, media, corporations, and political figures into a single, silent rhythm. A concept agreed upon at this gathering can become national policy within years via an activated campaign, a restructured institution, or a rationalized global crisis. There is no overt conspiracy, only an eerie consensus among those who've never run for office, but who influence election outcomes, among those who never draft laws but are present before they're written. No minutes are recorded, but everyone knows what happens next. And so Bilderberg doesn't need to exist in the open. It isn't an organization. It's the pulse of consensus among those who've learned how to rule without ever needing to reign. No more swords, only strategy. No more sanctuaries, only security schedules. But the essence remains unchanged, a circle of the chosen bound by memory, blood, and the ability to make the world believe it's running freely. In the smooth shadows of luxury conference rooms, what was once sworn beneath the Temple of Solomon may still be whispered, not in Latin, but with a nod. If the world is a stage, then the financial markets are the backstage, where all the strings are quietly pulled. Here, the leading actors never step into the spotlight. They don't run for office, they don't make public speeches, they exist behind the numbers, behind the charts, the bailouts, and the interest rate hikes. And if we trace the origins of this global mechanism, the system that now governs the world economy, we'll find that it isn't new. It's something very old, so old, in fact, that it was once burned for being too far ahead of its time, the financial architecture of the Templars. As early as the 12th century, the Knights Templar had already laid down the principles of modern banking, cross-regional money transfers, guaranteed promissory notes, asset trusteeship, custodial management. The Templars didn't need to conquer land to control territory, they controlled the flow of capital through it. They lent to popes and kings alike, serving as the financial intermediaries for nearly every major war. But that same independence made them the greatest threat to any authority that couldn't control them. When the order collapsed, the system didn't vanish, it simply changed form. It reorganized through private financial dynasties, and by the 17th and 18th centuries, it re-emerged, this time as central banking. But central banks are not government agencies, they are independent entities overseen by unelected boards, operating as trust chambers of financial memory. They do not answer to parliaments, they answer to principles that predate most constitutions. The US Federal Reserve, Fed, the European Central Bank, ECB, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, they all share one trait: a closed structure managed by individuals from long-standing financial lineages. Many of these families trace distant roots to houses once protected or empowered by the Templars. Names like Warburg, Lazard, Goldschmidt, Rothschild still appear regularly on advisory boards, as if governed by some unwritten law. Basel, home of the BIS, the central bank of central banks, was once a post-Templar hub in Europe, where documents and treasures were said to have been relocated after 1307. According to leaked sources, the vault system beneath the BIS is designed with asymmetrical access. No one has full entry. Only the chosen hold the dual key principle, an idea first used in Templar treasuries in Languedoc. But the most remarkable truth of this system is this: power no longer needs to control governments. It only needs to control the cost of borrowing. It doesn't need to own corporations, only to steer the capital flowing into them. It doesn't have to dominate media, only to influence the sentiment that media reacts to. In that way, the entire machinery of visible power ends up marching to a pulse no one can see and no one can stop. In that world, bloodlines are the only thing that cannot be digitized. They persist through quiet marriages, through family trust boards, through layers of decentralized influence that are never written down. They don't exist in human form alone. They exist as voices with veto, not to decide everything, but to prevent anything that strays too far from the core design. And while elections change, presidents' treaties are signed and broken, one thing has remained constant: the strata of bloodlines behind central banking have never shifted. Names may change, but they are always succeeded by someone close enough. If the Templars once built a financial system powerful enough to make the Pope their debtor, then the modern world may still be living in a more refined version of that same system, one so embedded no one needs to call it a secret society anymore, because the rules were programmed long before the game began. And the frightening part isn't that we don't know who wrote the rules, it's that the rules were written before we realized we were playing. In today's world, you don't need an army to conquer territory. You don't need policy to shape ideology. All it takes is an image. A single frame, a news segment, or a 90-minute film can rewrite history in the minds of millions. And at the center of that soft power are people the public never knows by name, yet they are present at every stage: funding, editing, green lighting the very world we believe is free. From Hollywood to global media giants like Comcast, Disney, Time Warner, Bertelsmann, and Viacom, behind each brand lies a web of ownership so complex even financial experts struggle to trace its origin. But if you're patient enough to follow the trail all the way back, you'll find something familiar. Families tied to old financial lineages, trusts that date back to the 18th century, founding boards that never appear on screen, but can end any project with a single call. Hollywood, the so-called Temple of Dreams, is also a factory of memory reconstruction. In hundreds of films about secret societies, forgotten treasures, ancient symbols, and lost maps, the Templars appear again and again, sometimes as villains corrupted by power, sometimes as noble guardians of forgotten truths, but never, ever does a major film ask the real question: what if they never disappeared? And if they didn't, where are they now? That absence is no accident. It's a subtle stopping point, as if there's an invisible line in the screenwriting process. You can reference myth, but don't touch reality. You may recreate symbols, but never explain their source. Memory isn't censored, it's curated. Even in films that have nothing to do with the Templars, their symbols still appear: the Red Cross, the Twin Pillars, the all-seeing eye, the unfinished pyramid. From Marvel blockbusters to major music videos, no explanation needed, just presence, disguised as aesthetic, masked as coincidence. But for those who know how to read the signs, the message is clear. The story is being retold according to a script written long ago. This system doesn't require a conspiracy. It functions like a self-filtering mechanism. Tell the right story, you get funding, distribution, awards. Tell the wrong one, you get no platform, no studio, no audience, no need to ban. Just quietly ensure it doesn't exist. Some of the world's top film schools, USC, NYU, or major studios like Pinewood and Babelsberg, have board members tied to noble or financial families with histories that go far beyond entertainment. Documentary funding groups, film grant foundations, elite cinema awards, they all operate under closed-loop governance. Only the selected get to tell the stories that are acceptable. And when an entire generation grows up seeing the Templars as villains or as mysterious treasure guardians, no one stops to ask, what if they're still here? Just not in the film. But in the room where films are approved. That's the power of narrative design. When you no longer need to change the truth, only how people access it. When the public believes they're being enlightened, but in reality they're being guided down a path already laid out. And so the Templar legacy doesn't just live on in bloodlines, in finance, in symbols. It lives in what we think is our memory, but is really the product of a precise filter, placed at just the right place, at just the right time. No distortion needed, just a retelling so perfectly framed you never think to ask the question. As the world spirals deeper into a crisis of trust, governments falter, religions lose influence, media faces public doubt, and science, once seen as salvation, begins to transform into a commodified service. Something quiet is happening. Amid this vortex of instability, a subtle phenomenon has begun to unfold: the silent return of ancient bloodlines, not hidden in the shadows, but stepping forward one by one as if to redesign the world itself. Since the start of the 21st century, a new class of young individuals has begun appearing at private gatherings: Davos, Aspen, the World Economic Forum, Bilderberg Youth Initiatives. They are not self-made entrepreneurs or brilliant scholars randomly invited. They are the 10th generation of a European banking house, the heirs of land-owning dynasties dating back to Napoleon, the descendants of those who once financed the Vatican or the Freemasons. On public record, they're labeled strategic advisors or social innovation partners. But anyone who has entered the upper tiers knows these are the successors, the ones chosen to continue the network. At institutions like the Trilateral Youth Council, the Phoenix Club, or the Circle of 33, the old rites are still practiced, not out of nostalgia, but because memory must be transferred. There are no cameras, no live streams, only oaths spoken in ancient Latin, symbols etched on rings, on cufflinks, or on genealogical charts, sealed behind reinforced glass in private libraries. Everything is preserved, not for decoration, but because they are the encryption of memory. Some of the world's top tech corporations have quietly begun to recruit under non-public lineage policies, not just for financial pedigree but for cultural legacy. Certain families have even acquired genomic testing firms solely to map internal bloodlines, ensuring that those designing the future are, quite literally, aligned with memory. It's no longer about hiring talent, it's about choosing those who belong. Even the language of the 21st century is shifting. In speeches on AI, Web3, blockchain, and the metaverse, phrases now surface that feel eerily familiar. Decentralized ethical governance, the sacred architecture of data, the inheritance of ancient knowledge in the age of machine learning. It sounds innovative. But to those fluent in ancient symbol systems, this is how the Templars spoke of knowledge 8 centuries ago. Equally striking is the purposeful repetition of symbols in emerging architecture, twin stone pillars framing the entrance to an AI research center, a circular skylight aligned with the Fibonacci sequence, a facade measured to a 33:11 ratio, subtle engravings on the far corners of walls, each one a declaration without a word. The legacy has returned. And this time, they don't need to hide. The world is tired of old institutions, ready to embrace anyone who seems to know what they're doing. And so, the bearers of ancient bloodlines step forward not to rule, but to redefine. They don't need official power, they only need to be called architects of the future. No manifestos, just continuity, not in darkness, but in plain daylight under the glow of the algorithms they're now writing themselves. In the modern world, the Vatican is an anomaly. Smaller than a city park, yet its influence extends across global politics, diplomacy, finance, and moral authority. Most know it as the heart of Catholicism, a sanctuary of faith and sacred mystery. But beneath the gilded vestments and ornate ritual, there may lie a current long thought extinguished but never truly gone, the Knights Templar. The Templars were once the Church's iron hand. They protected the Holy Land, managed Catholicism's financial system, and served the Pope as its armed force. But when they grew too powerful, too independent, too difficult to control, it was the Vatican itself that moved to purge them. In 1307, with the help of King Philip IV of France, Pope Clement V signed the decree to destroy the order, not solely for heresy, but because the Templars had created a parallel system, a network of knowledge, credit, and bloodlines. What's strange is this: centuries later, the Vatican has never released the full records of that purge. Forced confessions, trial documents, asset transfers are all sealed within the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, accessible only to a chosen few. The question remains, why would a 700-year-old case still need to be locked away? A controversial yet persistent theory lingers. The Vatican never truly destroyed the Templars. They only extinguished the public face. What remained, the knowledge, the bloodline, the essence, was quietly absorbed into the Church itself. Many Templar monks weren't executed. They were reassigned to other orders, Benedictines, Cistercians, and most notably the Jesuits, founded 2 centuries after the Templars, but curiously aligned in purpose: global influence, educational control, and preservation of knowledge under religious cover. In Jesuit architecture throughout Rome, sacred geometry, light projection, and the symmetrical alignment of theological memory persist, as though someone continued a design first drawn by Templars. Major Jesuit churches in Spain, Portugal, and Latin America preserve symbols never seen in early Christianity, yet unmistakably familiar to anyone fluent in Templar codes. Today, many archbishops leading Vatican councils come from noble European families long suspected of Templar descent. Certain church libraries housing unpublished ancient texts are managed by special orders, selected not by academic merit, but by family tradition. In the Vatican, bloodline is never declared, but it has never been absent. Pope John Paul II was once unofficially quoted as saying, "There are memories not written down, not because they're false, but because the world isn't ready to read them." In that light, the Templars are no longer heretics, they are living memory. Part of the Vatican, not by proclamation, but through people, structure, and continuity. And if that's true, then the greatest irony becomes the greatest logic. The ones once burned alive for threatening the Church may now be the ones quietly maintaining it from within, not in rebellion, but in guardianship, not to avenge, but to ensure that what was once burned is never forgotten. The Vatican stands as the epicenter of spiritual power. But behind the public doctrines, behind the polished theology and candlelit masses, there have always been hidden doors, places without incense, without bells, but where decisions are made that reshape history. Among these hidden channels, two orders stand out and are often misunderstood: the Jesuits and Opus Dei. They may appear as religious institutions, but when you look deeper into their structures, symbols, and influence, you realize they are not just missionaries, they are guardians of memory. The Jesuits, founded in 1540 by Ignatius Loyola, emerged in a Catholic world shaken by Reformation. But from the beginning, they didn't operate like a traditional order. They didn't build monasteries to pray. They built schools, libraries, military academies, and intelligence networks that spanned Europe and its colonies. They became the professors of princes, advisors to kings, and authors of the world's theology textbooks. This expansion wasn't reactionary, it was strategic. Opus Dei, founded later in the 20th century, chose a subtler path. No churches, no armies. They embedded themselves in finance, law, education, media, and especially within the power structure of the Vatican. Opus Dei doesn't recruit the public, they invite. And only those with the right ethics, intellect, and, crucially, lineage are even considered. In documents leaked from the Vatican Library, references appear to Templar monks who escaped persecution by being reintegrated into secret orders in Spain, Bavaria, and Switzerland. These men were not executed. They changed names, changed orders, but they preserved the manuscripts, symbols, and organizational maps of the Templars. The phrase Ordo Interioris, the inner order, appears repeatedly in internal records from the 14th and 15th centuries. One coded phrase is repeated in those texts: Deus est veritas, et sanguis eius vivet. God is truth, and his blood shall live on. It's not from the Bible, but it matches, word for word, a stone inscription found in the crypt beneath Château de Gisors, once a Templar stronghold. Both the Jesuits and Opus Dei are structured in 3 tiers with an innermost circle that is nearly invisible to the outside world. Leadership is not elected, it is elevated by internal consensus. Not the smartest, but the one who understands best what must never be spoken. They preserve memory, not through preaching, but through networks. In many of their secret initiations, ancient Templar symbols quietly reappear. A sword plunged into the ground, a circle inscribed within a square, light projected downward from pillar to stone, used not as tribute, but as encryption, not to honor the past, but to protect what must never be written. Pope Francis, the first Jesuit pontiff in history, once said, "True reform is returning to what was forgotten." No one asked what he meant, but under his papacy, some previously sealed Templar records have been quietly reopened for internal review. Several post-doctrinal orders have begun revisiting Templar scholarship, not to condemn, but to reconsider. If the Templars were once burned for guarding secrets, then the Jesuits and Opus Dei may be the institutions where those secrets are now encrypted beneath layers of refined theology. No more warriors, only scholars, no more swords, only councils. But what is protected remains the same: ancient memory, silent bloodlines, and an oath that has never been revoked, not out of thirst for power, but because the world still isn't ready to reread the first page. As the world entered the age of steel, glass, and concrete, many believed the language of symbols had died. That golden domes, stone pillars etched with codes, shafts of light aligned with solstices, were relics of a mystical past. But look closer at modern buildings, international conference centers, central bank headquarters, the global HQs of tech giants, and you'll see, memory didn't vanish, it changed form. The language of the Templars, golden ratios, Pythagorean geometry, sacred symmetry, once defined sacred architecture. These principles weren't decorative, they were coded knowledge. Every curve, every angle, every beam of light was a declaration of an order embedded within matter itself. And astonishingly, those same principles are reappearing, not in cathedrals, but in the most seemingly secular buildings of the modern world. Take the United Nations headquarters in New York. The facade is glass, yes, but the floor plan follows a 3:1 ratio, and the light-to-depth alignment reflects the reflective chapel blueprint once used by the Templars. A rear corridor contains exactly 33 horizontal stone blocks, matching the 33 initiatory steps of Freemasonry. Vatican Radio's headquarters, the Louvre's modern wing, Denver International Airport, all reveal intentional geometries, guided light paths, and architectural ciphers that are anything but random. Some of these modern structures were built atop ancient ley line intersections, a sacred energy grid the Templars once used to align their chapels with Earth's natural force lines. When asked, the architects of these buildings refer to geometric tradition, internal order, or the sacred language of light, phrases that echo the Templars' medieval texts, almost word for word. Not everyone sees it, but those chosen to enter certain rooms, beneath a dome that casts sunlight precisely onto the center of a council table at noon, or seated between two columns identical to Jachin and Boaz, know, this is not just a room, this is a manuscript, unwritten, yet always being read. Many of the most renowned architects of the 20th and 21st centuries come from families once linked to the Templars or their Masonic successors. They never publicly mention a tradition, but in interviews they often refer to the influence of architectural schools never taught in universities. They use light as language, voids as punctuation, and material as memory. Each structure whispers of knowledge that has no archive except stone itself. There are no more crusades, but cross-shaped sculptures still rise in public parks, no more fortresses. Yet global control centers mirror the proportions of Templar commanderies. No more relics, but encrypted data vaults are being built in the shape of underground chapels, with skylights aligned to the sun's position on the spring equinox. And so the Templar bloodline, no longer living through name or title, lives through form. No vow is needed, just a column set at 33 degrees. No scripture, just a round window casting light on a bare wall on the exact day of a global summit. When you walk into a building and feel a strange stillness, a balance that transcends engineering, a presence not in sound but in structure. You may not just be entering a space, you may be entering a stratum of memory, a memory not meant for everyone, but one that always recognizes those who have learned to see with eyes once opened. In the Middle Ages, power was carved in stone. In the modern world, it's encrypted in systems. If the Templars once controlled finance through handwritten letters, safeguarded treasure with maps, and preserved memory through symbols, then today, everything they once protected may now reside within data centers, invisible, abstract, yet in control of everything. No more stone fortresses. Today, power hides in colossal servers. No more red crosses, only encrypted strings. And yet, in this cold, impersonal infrastructure, the organizational models, the tiered logic, and the operational codes curiously mirror those of the Templar network. The Templars were among the first to run a transcontinental system, delegating authority through levels, encrypting knowledge through symbols and signals. Today's tech giants, Google, Meta, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, operate global ecosystems beyond the reach of any single nation. And the founders or key executives behind many of these systems often trace their heritage back to old European families, not all, but more than coincidence can explain. Independent researchers have pointed out patterns. Founders educated at institutions where secret societies still quietly operate: Stanford, Harvard, Oxford. Recipients of special scholarships, members of discreet intellectual clubs. Some scholars have called it blood selection, not resume selection. On the symbolic level, it gets stranger. Many headquarters of tech firms in California, Berlin, and Tel Aviv are built on ley line intersections, designed with layouts eerily similar to ancient Templar strongholds. Architects call it natural energy balancing. But to those fluent in symbols, it reads like a silent acknowledgement. Some of the world's most powerful artificial intelligence systems, especially large language models, LLMs, are being trained on billions of documents, including texts never made public. Early funding often comes from trusts named after old European houses, quietly registered in offshore havens. Some projects even establish separate ethics boards, with authority that overrides the CEO. Sounds like science fiction. But here's what matters. If power no longer lies in weapons, but in data, then controlling the definition of knowledge becomes the highest form of dominance. And if those who once carried ancient memory were burned alive for holding knowledge beyond their time, perhaps today they've found a safer haven. Inside algorithms no one fully understands. In a world where everything can be digitized, bloodlines no longer need to show up in flesh. They can exist as ownership, as training rights, as funding authority, as the hand that defines ethical boundaries for artificial intelligence. And if you believe the future will be governed by AI, ask yourself, who taught it? Who gave it data? Who wrote its worldview? And ultimately, who has the right to turn it off? Because when power has learned how to disappear, the only place you'll recognize it is in the questions you were never allowed to ask. September 11th, 2001. 2 planes hit the Twin Towers. One crashed into the Pentagon, another vanished in the skies over Pennsylvania. More than 3,000 people dead. The world was in shock. But in the midst of the smoke and rubble, something rose that wasn't just fear. It was a new order. Just weeks after the attack, sweeping surveillance laws were passed. Individual freedoms shrank at a scale never seen before. Governments gained permission to intervene in digital lives, redraw borders, and wage wars in places that had never been part of the conversation. But what no one saw was who designed the response and who stood to benefit. In diplomatic corridors, emergency meetings began. Quiet gatherings of people with no official titles, not politicians, but hedge fund chairs, strategic consultants, and representatives of old banking families. They issued no public statements, yet every major policy was test-floated with them before it was announced. According to leaked documents, in the summer of 2001, just weeks before 9/11, there were a series of private meetings in Geneva, Basel, and Montserrat, Spain, a remote monastery that once sheltered post-Templar descendants in the 14th century. No official attendee list exists, but records of private security hires, jet bookings, and restricted airspace lockdowns do. One independent genealogical researcher claimed to trace at least 3 noble European bloodlines with family members present at those gatherings. Within weeks of the attacks, some had moved vast wealth into surveillance tech, cybersecurity, and defense, earning billions in the years that followed. Others made suspicious trades, shorting airline stocks days before the disaster, through century-old trusts registered to untraceable entities. There is no evidence that ancient bloodlines orchestrated 9/11. But what's striking is this: if there were a group with enough knowledge of history, enough patience, and enough emotional detachment to see catastrophe as an opportunity to redesign global systems. They would not act like terrorists, they would act like architects. The Templars were once burned alive, not just for their wealth, but for possessing a vision that spanned centuries. They believed that sometimes, to rebuild the world, a great shock was needed. Not something explainable in the moment, but entirely logical, if seen from the eyes of those rewriting the rules. The post-9/11 world is one where people accepted losing freedoms in exchange for the illusion of safety, where tech giants gained control over the flow of information, where algorithms replaced constitutions in deciding who gets seen and who gets silenced. And if anyone ever learned that the most powerful form of control is the one that's requested voluntarily, it would be those who had survived purges, who understood that power doesn't need to be seized, only reaction needs to be designed. In the darkness of crisis, while the world trembles waiting for answers, there are always those who step forward with blueprints, emergency laws, solutions, and the promise of order. They don't need to say who they are, they just need the world to follow. If the Templars never truly vanished, then maybe they never needed to return. They only needed to ensure that in every crisis, the hand offering the global solution belonged to a very old memory. You don't need a throne if you can decide who sits on it. You don't need to write the laws if you control those who do. And you don't need to appear in public if every door must pass through your hand before it opens. This is power without symbols, only the invisible right to veto. And it's the form of power ancient bloodlines have perfected over centuries of persecution, adaptation, and silent persistence, until they became the back-end software of the modern world. Today, presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, and billionaires rise and fall like interchangeable parts, but peer deeper into the layer beneath, into advisory councils, family trusts, cross-owned corporations, and capital control structures. And you begin to see the final decision-makers are rarely in the room. They're behind the curtain, not because they need to hide, but because they don't need to appear. The modern elite is not a spontaneous class. They are the outcome of a quiet, generational selection process: bloodline, education, marital alliance, private ethical contracts, and above all, memory retention without leakage. The faces you see in the media are often just the surface layer of a deeper, older, more persistent architecture, a Templar logic updated for the postmodern era. This order doesn't function through commands. It functions by making all other options disappear. No bans, just silence. No opposition, just delay, until only one path remains reasonable. And what makes it impossible to overthrow is precisely this: it has no name, it's not on paper, it has no headquarters, no annual conference. It exists as a fluid network where noble bloodlines interconnect through marriage, capital, academia, and narrative flow. Companies that appear to compete are owned by the same trust. Nations that seem to clash are bound by the same debt architecture. Media that appears diverse is distributed by the same algorithm. No need to win over the masses, only to hold the keys to doors no one else can open. No need to command armies, only to oversee the banks that pay them. No need to censor articles, only to govern the code that determines what spreads. This is not the old model of power where kings issued decrees, popes issued threats, and governments signed edicts. This is structural era power. Whoever controls the logic of how things operate holds true dominion. And in that world, those who have mastered how to survive nameless for 700 years may be the only ones who no longer need visible power. Because they have become the rules themselves. No one calls them Templars anymore. They don't need the title. But if all roads eventually lead to the same families, the same thought architecture, the same class that never leaves the negotiation table, then perhaps they never vanished. They only changed roles, from knights to architects, from guardians of a sacred land to designers of the world. A power that doesn't need to speak to issue commands. It only needs to be present, like the silent axis around which the wheel of history turns. History has never been a straight line. Empires rise, then collapse. Crowns change heads. Institutions come and go, each claiming authority over the world. But there is one thing that, if patient enough and protected well enough, needs no declaration, no revolution to endure: bloodline. If the Templar lineage truly still exists, it has survived the unthinkable, from medieval fire to Reformation, from the Industrial Age to world wars, through market crashes, and now into the age of artificial intelligence. No longer wielding swords, they write algorithms. No longer conquering fortresses, they own data infrastructure. No longer founding kingdoms, they redesign order in the form of structure. Look at it all: centuries-old banking families, media networks overseen by unnamed boards, tech giants headquartered on ancient ley lines, universities admitting students based on invisible criteria, investment trajectories converging toward a core group of names. And you begin to see, we don't live in the free society we thought we did. We live in a world that's been designed, not by nations, but by memory. And if those in power today are, in truth, the 28th generation of families who once sat in the Templar councils of the 12th century, then we're no longer talking about power, we're talking about legacy. The legacy of an order burned alive for being ahead of its time. An order that learned never to repeat its greatest mistake. Not to stand against the world, but to merge with it. Not to fight it head-on, but to steer it from within. Maybe they no longer call themselves Templars. Maybe they no longer believe in the Holy Land, but they still believe in one thing: the world must not be left in the hands of the crowd. And if that's true, then every revolution is merely surface-level restructuring. The axis of control never moved. It stayed exactly where you were never meant to look. We're not taught this, not in school books, not in the news, not in liberal education programs, but the traces are everywhere: in architecture, in financial law, in corporate structure, in the way information is filtered, distributed, and framed. And so the final question isn't, who are they? It's this: have we ever truly escaped them? With all our progress, our chaos, our reforms, has the world ever truly slipped out of reach from a memory that survived every book burning? If your answer is, I'm not sure, then maybe. The Templars never disappeared. They just stood where the light never shines. And from there, they've been turning the axis of the world, 1 degree at a time, never missing a beat. There is no crown more subtle than kindness, no power more enduring than the power delivered under the banner of salvation. When those who rule no longer call themselves rulers, but helpers, control reaches a level where no one even thinks to question it. And if the Templars understood anything about human nature better than anyone else, it was exactly this. In the Middle Ages, they wielded swords, yet built hospitals. They fought battles, yet offered sanctuary to pilgrims. The blend of warrior and saint, blood and compassion, made it impossible for Europe to define them clearly. Today, the model has returned, not in castles or knights, but in global NGOs, supranational charitable foundations, and ambitious world-rebuilding programs offering scholarships, healthcare, food, and education. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Open Society Foundations, Wellcome Trust, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, the Clinton Global Initiative. They are not just humanitarian institutions. They are funders of global health policy. They rewrite education in developing nations. They set ethical standards for emerging technologies. They influence what is taught in the world's most elite universities. Their internal structures are not fully public. Their governing boards are unelected. Their financial disclosures are partial at best. And nearly all of them operate through layers of satellite partners, local arms led by graduates of elite Western institutions, where the memory of power isn't taught through textbooks but through the atmosphere. What do these organizations have in common? Yes, wealth, yes, influence, but above all, immunity from scrutiny. When a body delivers vaccines, clean water, scholarships, and disaster relief, who dares to object? When an institution funds journalism, documentaries, textbooks, and think tanks, who can still tell what truth was written for justice and what truth was curated for direction? Familiar Templar symbols have quietly reappeared. The stylized red cross, the six-pointed radiant star, twin pillars, the circle nested within the square. They no longer belong to religion or war, but show up in logos, in organizational charts, in the hidden geometries of capital allocation maps. Each detail alone says nothing. But when seen with an awakened eye, it becomes clear nothing is random. The Templars were once burned alive for carrying knowledge ahead of their time. But if they learned how to restructure, their greatest lesson may have been this: don't fight the system, redefine it, don't hold the sword, hold the heart, don't impose, just make the world follow you willingly, because when power wears the mask of benevolence, it becomes invincible. You don't need to seize the throne if you can decide who gets written into the history books. You don't need to rule a nation if you control the global system of awards, honors, and recognition. Because once you have the power to decide who is deemed great, you're not just shaping the present, you've already begun rewriting the future. From the Nobel Prize to knighthoods, from the Legion of Honor to rare titles bestowed by the Vatican, European monarchies, or ancient fraternal orders, these honors all share one principle. Titles are not created by the people. They are granted by a council, and that council is not elected. It exists as a self-perpetuating entity with members appointed from academies, lineages, or esoteric societies, so deeply embedded that no one even asks, who chose the choosers? The Nobel Prize is perhaps the clearest example. Founded by Alfred Nobel, a munitions magnate turned philanthropist, the prize has long outgrown its scientific roots. The selection committees operate behind closed doors, voting records are sealed. Many board members come from old Nordic families historically linked to post-Templar military and financial elites. Likewise, the knighthoods of the United Kingdom, or honours from Catholic orders like the Knights of Malta, the Order of St. Lazarus, or the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, all trace their origins to medieval knightly systems, and many were directly tied to the Templars. Though they now wear the cloak of humanitarian or honorary, these orders still hold the power to confer recognition, and with it, soft influence without direct control. When someone receives a global honor, it's more than recognition. They become part of a system that legitimizes ideology, a symbolic ambassador of the structure that bestowed the title. When most recipients come from the same schools, same networks, same bloodlines, the system becomes a closed circuit. The chosen confirm the choosers. Dig deep into the lists of past honorees and you'll see the same names, the same universities, the same belief systems, and when someone dissents, dares to challenge the structure or disrupt the defined order, they are almost never acknowledged, no matter how great the contribution. As if recognition itself has become a filter for the future of memory. If the Templars were once burned for preserving forbidden knowledge, their descendants may have learned a far greater lesson. Don't just preserve knowledge, control its definition, because once you control what knowledge means, you don't need to be in charge. You only need to be the one who decides who gets permission to lead. A title, a medal, a global commendation is the modern-day crown. No one needs to kneel, but everyone still bows. Every fallen dynasty leaves ruins. Every collapsed empire leaves behind documents, images, monuments. But there is a form of power that leaves nothing, only silence, an influence that cannot be traced, cannot be questioned, yet pulses steadily like the heartbeat of a system with no central organ. This is the power of those who never speak, never appear, yet are always in the right place, at the right time. If the Templar bloodline still exists, it may have chosen not to survive through its name, but through memory. Memory encoded into structure. Ancient trusts, discrete alliances, unlisted genealogies. They don't stand in front of cameras because their presence isn't on stage, it's backstage where real decisions are made. There are families that never appear in the media, but hold permanent seats on multi-sector investment councils. Names you've never heard, yet they possess veto power over who gets to speak at global summits. People with no social media presence, yet they're the last to review the ethical policies of artificial intelligence before they're released to the public. In cities like London, Vienna, Lisbon, and Basel, once hubs of the post-Templar network, there exist private archives that have never been digitized. They are never auctioned, never indexed, never shown in national libraries. Some researchers granted temporary access speak of deer-hide scrolls, redacted family trees, and letters written in ancient cipher where the Templar oath has been rewritten for a new age, no longer with swords, but with the will to continue. Among these documents appears a concept called the sleeping blood, individuals born from minor branches, living ordinary lives, unaware of their origin until the time comes. When the world begins to slip into disorder, a signal is sent, a memory awakens, not by command, but by coincidences so precise they cease to be coincidences. No one knows for certain who holds the key. It may be a nameless council operating as an interfamily network that spans centuries. It may be one person with no file, no portrait, but whose card is always on the table when the world's most consequential decisions are made. Or perhaps this structure is no longer even human. Perhaps it now exists as a coded sequence within the algorithms that direct global capital, within the AI filters that shape consciousness, within the organizational superstructures so vast that even those inside don't realize what they're serving. If the Templars were once burned for seeing too far ahead, their descendants may have discovered how to survive without ever being seen, by becoming the foundation itself, a foundation that never needs to appear, because everything is now built on top of it. There are stories that are never meant to be finished, not because they have no ending, but because their very lack of closure is part of their design. Every time a bloodline is broken, a legacy burned, a structure shattered, something always remains. quiet, beyond time, and sometimes beyond history's ability to accept it. The Templar bloodline, if it still exists, has endured through eras that even the greatest empires couldn't survive. From Solomon's Temple to Rosslyn Chapel, from stone fortresses across medieval Europe to the digital control centers of the 21st century, from ancient sanctuaries to private boardrooms, that blood, if real, has never stopped flowing. No titles, no thrones, just memory, woven into symbols, data, structure, and silence. We've crossed more than 7 centuries of redacted history, erased, rewritten, then encoded again. The Templars didn't just trade the sword for the blueprint. They didn't just retreat from the battlefield to become the architects of order. They gave up their very name, so they could dissolve into the world like a foundation too deep to ever remove. And in doing so, they no longer needed to be mentioned. They only needed to be continued. No one knows exactly who they are. Maybe they're a nameless council, maybe a lineage deliberately severed and scattered, or maybe they're not even people anymore, not in the usual sense, but rather the way this world has been pre-written, an underlying logic, an organizing instinct, an invisible blueprint that always brings decisions back to an axis no one is allowed to question. If today's world is run by algorithms, then who wrote them? Who decides what's ethical? What is allowed to exist? Who defines which crisis becomes a turning point? And why do certain names keep reappearing? Not in the headlines, but in the internal acknowledgements of the world's most critical documents. We live in a world structured like a network, but no one is taught how to read the diagram. Every time you believe you're making a free choice, remember, true freedom doesn't lie in what you choose. It lies in who wrote the list of what you're allowed to choose from. If real power is the ability to make others stop asking questions, then maybe the Templars were never destroyed. Maybe they simply learned how to become the invisible layer beneath what we call normal. And so the final question is no longer, do they still exist, but rather, has the world ever truly escaped them?